Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
Dr. Christine Fair is a Distinguished Associate Fellow in the Peace and Security Studies Program with Georgetown University, Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She has previously served as a senior political scientist with the rank Cooperation, a political officer with the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan and Kabul, and a senior research associate with USIP's Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention. She has served as senior fellow at West Point's Combating Terrorism Center, a senior resident fellow at the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. And we will now talk about her new book, in their words. To start, ma'am, you have written several books, but this is a particular book which spoke about the Lashkar-e-Taiba in one of the most elaborate ways possible. So if you can give us a brief overview of your book, and we can move on to the other question from there.
Most of the books that have been written on Lashkar-e-Taiba focus on what it does, where, and how, right? So Stephen Tankel's book is a really good book, but it's a history of it as a terrorist organization. What people haven't really focused on is the domestic politics of Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is to say, how does the organization function within Pakistan itself? Right. And so this book is really trying to fill this critical space that tries to understand what are the different amenities that the organization provides to the Pakistani state within Pakistan itself. Right. So it covers, what it does outside of Pakistan, mostly killings under the guidance of the ISI with, I think, extraordinary discipline. But what I think the biggest contribution to this book is really how it functions within Pakistan itself.
My next question is about, you predominantly rely on internal literature, which is produced by the Lashkar-e-Taiba. And why did you choose other empirical methods, such as interviews, when you wrote the book? Why did you just use literature, the internal literature?
Well, that's really simple. People lie. That's the most straightforward answer, is that, these are terrorists. Do you think terrorists are going to tell you the truth? The other issue is that, I can't go back to Pakistan. Because of my work on the Pakistan Army, I will probably never be allowed to go back. And there's also issues of gender, interviewing these guys. I met Yahya Mujahid a couple of times, and frankly, it was just a big deal. Because I'm a female. It wasn't because I was American. It wasn't the big deal that Jessica Stern makes it out to be in her book when she met him. But it quite frankly, it was a pain. Very few women have met with Hafiz Saeed, for example.
Yeah.
So, it's the payoff just isn't worth the risk, especially when you consider that they're not honest. And so what their publications do is that their publications tell us what they tell the world. And the advantage of publications is that we can directly tie the publication to the organization. Like, for example, Hafiz Saeed himself figures in many of the publications. And so this gives us, I'm not saying that the publications speak truth, but the publications reflect their ideology. And I think that's more important than, quote, the truth. So the book that I just sent to my publisher and to my editor is the follow-on to this. And this book that I just sent to my editor is actually, and it's so hard to describe this book. This book has just been killing me. It's basically, it's a collection of their writings translated into English with critical annotations. So it's a beast. It's really a beast. But what that does is that it really gives the reader who really cares about this group an opportunity to really delve into its worldview. And one of the things that one finds when you read the stuff that Lashkar publishes is that there's a lot of similarity to the stuff that the Pakistan Army publishes. So, or for example, if you were to read the translations of the Shaheed biographies written by the mothers, there's this performance of grief, right, that mothers are expected to do. Many of them are married, but you don't hear from their wives because the affection that a wife has for a husband is tainted through lust, right? Whereas the mother's love for a son is it's pure, no one questions it. And when I was reading Mariam Rashid's book called Dying to Serve, where she does an ethnography of the Pakistani enlisted. Now, she's the kind of person that can do interviews, but she herself is a Fauji daughter. She has a long lineage of Faujis. What really struck me is that when the Faujis ask mothers of slain soldiers, whom they also call Shaheed, it is the same performance of grief, right? They don't, wives are not trusted because the wife is tainted by her sexual relationship with her slain husband. So what you see is like the myths, like the two nation theory comes. Sometimes if we were to play a game, was this written by the Pakistan Army or by Lashkar-e-Taiba? You can't really tell, right? They're just that similar. And so one of the things that we get from the text is that you really see this symbiosis of ideology between the Pakistan Army and Lashkar-e-Taiba. And you won't necessarily get that from interviews, right? Because the person that you'll be interviewing, and you'll see this, like Stephen Tankel relies very extensively on interviews, and I don't trust interviews. I don't use interviews in my work anywhere because people lie. But if you're interviewing someone from the Lashkar-e-Taiba, they don't have an incentive to tell you the truth. They don't have an incentive to tell you how close they work with the Pakistan Army because they don't want to admit it. In fact, this is one of the biggest schisms between Lashkar-e-Taiba and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and the Islamic State, is that all of these other organizations view Lashkar-e-Taiba very suspiciously because they know that they are the handmaiden of the IFI. So to your question, I find texts to be a more honest reflection of what they say they are.
Since you are an academic scholar and you have published a lot, so let me just go back to your fellow academicians who have, like Alex Sherman and Albert Jongman in 1988. So explicitly, one of their research said that majority of the research on terrorism studies is based on literature review. And they went on to explain that because of this methodology, a lot of this new information that comes out is just 20% of all the information that flutters of a research. And they went on to criticize that if people interviews, it's more at least they will get a side of there, because when you interview literature, you get one side of the picture.
Oh, you've misunderstood their argument.
Yeah.
It's important that you understand your misunderstanding.
Okay.
Okay, literature review is not what I have done. When scholars talk about a literature review, they talk about reviewing the secondary literature, right? Which is to say, they're basically rehearsing what everyone else has done, right? So when you, like, for example, almost every paper that you read, it starts with a literature review, The literature review is not primary data. The literature review is reviewing what other people have written. So don't confuse what I've done, because what I've done is I've accessed their primary data. A literature review is a review of the secondary data, or the secondary derivative literature. And they're correct. And the reason why people spend so much time regurgitating, this is what we would call a meta-analysis. It's an analysis of the analyses. Is because they don't have access to primary data, right? Yeah. And the other thing, so there are scholars who really think that interviews are important. And I do survey work, right? So survey work is a kind of interview. But there's another problem with interviews, and that is that you really don't know who that person is. You don't know, you have to take their word. Like they don't have, for example, an org chart, and they're not card carrying members. Here I am in this org chart. And, to give you an example of just how common this is, you'll maybe remember back in 2010, they found some Talib guy who wanted to enter negotiations. And the British government had gone to some considerable lengths to begin negotiating with this guy. It turns out he was just a non-walla, right? There was this guy named Alexei Dabai. He was an ABC journalist. He did all of these interviews with alleged Taliban in Pakistan, only to find out that they weren't Talibs at all. They were just a bunch of, Pashtuns in front of a cave. So so if you're doing these interviews, and I'll also make another point, very few of them, and Alex Schmidt is one of them, they don't know the language of the people that they're interviewing, and they are heavily reliant upon translators. And when I worked in Afghanistan, I'm not fluent in Dari, but I studied Farsi in Iran. So I can't really speak Dari, but I can tell when my translator's lying to me. And when I've interacted with US forces, I can see when their translator's not telling them the truth. And years ago, when I was an intern at the US consulate in Mumbai, the interviewers who were interviewing people for visas, they obviously needed a translator. And I saw repeatedly the translator lying. And like, for example, if you had an interviewer that was high caste and you had a low caste applicant, they would just completely misrepresent the interview because they didn't think that person should get a visa. So, interview data, I think, if it's done well, and if it's done by someone who actually knows the language and they know how to verify, but most of it doesn't happen that way. And the reason why most scholars don't rely upon the primary materials, and I'm going to be really blunt about this, you don't get this stuff on the internet. Right? I can't sit from home and download it. And that's why there's this obsession with jihad online, because scholars never have to leave. Like, they don't have to go to dangerous places. And Lashkar-e-Taiba doesn't really exist online. I mean, that's like a big ass myth. I mean, if you take all the Lashkar Twitter accounts and add them up together, I have more followers than they do, right? Same thing with their Facebook pages. They are a very face-to-face organization, and they really rely upon the circulation of the written word. And the reason for that is that, ironically, they are a very well-educated group on the main. And so when you read Lashkar's materials, you see how much more sophisticated they are intellectually, the kinds of arguments they make. When I compare them to the writings that I've been able to get from, say, Lashkar-e-Jungzi, oh my God, these guys are like, illiterate bevakoofs. I mean, it's like they can't maintain an argument in a paragraph, right? So anyway, be sure you understand what Alex Schmidt's talking about when we talk about literature reviews. He's talking about the review of the secondary literature, and he is right about that. Almost everyone, Stephen Tankle included, and then what happens is there's this, and this happens in journalism too, right? Once something gets out there, everyone keeps reporting it. And unless you try to figure out what was that original source, it just becomes circular reportage. And then everyone will take the 4 different journalists saying the same thing as confirmation of the truth, when all they're really doing is amplifying that one source that one person got. Yeah. So that's how.
All right.
But so, for example, that's how you get myths, right? So there's this myth that these guys are coming from madrasas. You get this myth that they are all undereducated. And this is because everyone's just reviewing the secondary literature. But my work, which is really reliant upon primary sources, this is just rubbish. This is not an organization that's based on madrasas. This is not an organization that uses unskilled labor, right? Anyway.
Yes. So, ma'am, when we learn about Pakistan and the very irregulars such as Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohommad, we also come across that Pakistan have many militant factions. They have created many militant factions over the past few decades, including the Harkatul Mujahideen, the TTP, Jaish-e-Mohommad, Harkatul Ansar, Al-Badra, etc., etc. So, in your book, In Their Own World, you have focused on Lashkar-e-Toiba, its recruitment, ideologies, training, etc. What I can see is that Lashkar-e-Toiba is far more indigenous than other groups. So what makes LET stand in the crowd of the jihadi spectrum?
So basically, there's this other myth, right, that Pakistan created all these groups. Like, for example, there's this myth that the ISI created the Taliban. That's not true at all. The Taliban made itself. But what Pakistan does, what the ISI does, it works like an investor, right? It sees a group emerge and it adds things that make it lethal, right? So Pakistan itself is like a petri dish. These groups are emerging, factions emerge, sometimes factions are manufactured. But what Pakistan's ISI can then do is that it's like an angel investor. It can invest in those groups that it thinks is going to execute its agenda better. Like, so you see this in Afghanistan, right? So for many, many years, it had invested in Haqqani. And the Haqqani network just failed to deliver. And then out of nowhere, I mean, they're not on the ISI's radar screen. The ISI didn't invent them. The Taliban pop up. And they're doing some things that look very interesting. And so there's this sort of punga that takes place during Benazir Bhutto's period, where they do this stunt where they're trying to arrange some transport, and they show that the Taliban can protect those convoys better than the previous jungbazi. And this becomes this demonstration effect. And so the ISI starts investing in them. The army starts training them. They get artillery support, huge amounts of money. And that's what takes the Taliban from this, small group based in Kandahar and Quetta into this organization that by 1996 has taken over most of the country. So the same thing happens with Lashkar-e-Taiba. It actually has its origins in Afghanistan, but it's a latecomer, so it's, you're all dressed up to go to the wedding that's already happened. So, and then because Lashkar-e-Taiba is adamant that it doesn't participate in intra-Islam fighting, it had no role to play after the Soviets withdrew and the different warlords began fighting amongst themselves, right? Namely, Hekmatyar on the one hand versus Ahmed Shah Massoud on the other. And so I said Haqqani a few minutes ago. I actually meant Hekmatyar. So for many years, they were supporting Hekmatyar, right? So
Hekmatyar, if I'm not
exactly,
wrong,
exactly, because he was a Pashtun. So when when they see the Taliban coming online, they throw their support behind the Taliban and they diminish their support for Hekmatyar. So the same thing happens with Lashkar-e-Taiba. So here they are, they're in Afghanistan. they formed their militia to fight the Russians, but the Russians have already begun to withdraw, and they don't really have anything to do, right, in Afghanistan. So they relocate to Kashmir. And they relocate to Kashmir at a time when the ISI was really bereft of options, right? Obviously they had already taken out the JKLF because it wasn't Islamist. And Hizbul Mujahideen, because they are too Kashmiri, wasn't brutal enough. So the Hizbul Mujahideen, for example, would never have set a shrine on fire. Like, this is not, they're too Kashmiri to be too vicious. Lashkar-e-Taiba didn't have any of those prohibitions on viciousness. So the ISI sees this opportunity to help LET become a much more efficient and brutal organization. And it does it at the expense of the organization's autonomy, right? Once it becomes this ISI proxy, it's in it all the way. The Pakistan Army develops their training procedures. The Pakistan Army makes sure that they are appropriately provisioned and so forth. You'll see a similar thing happening with Jaish-e-Mohommad, right? However, the Deobandi groups like Jaish, Harkatul Ansar, they are more manufactured, right? LET and the Afghan Taliban, they emerged on their own. These other Deobandi groups have a lot more orchestration. But when Jaish-e-Mohommad arrives on the scene, they're even more vicious than Lashkar-e-Taiba, right? Because Lashkar-e-Taiba does not do suicide attacks. Jaish does. So we see the first suicide attack in Kashmir is actually done by Jaish-e-Mohommad. And so the Pakistan Army can use these different assets in different combinations to create different kinds of effects. It gives them a lot of flexibility in terms of the kind of terror that they want to perpetrate. And the organizations also have different organizational reaches within India itself, right? So Lashkar has a much deeper reach into India. And you can see that from the attacks that it can perpetrate. I don't think Jaish has had much success getting beyond Delhi.
Yeah, that's right. So, ma'am, one quick follow-up on what you said about Lashkar-e-Toiba having its origins and roots from Afghanistan. These days, many assessments are coming from the intelligence community that the Islamic State Khorasan, which is running in Afghanistan, is overrated and is used by Pakistan for activities by Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Haqqani network. In any case, Islamic State Khorasan is split into two, with one part being run by Maulavi Faruqi, who is a Lashkar-e-Taiba cadre top commander. What are your reservations about this whole process of Lashkar-e-Taiba and Haqqani network facilitating the Islamic State Khorasan movement, which is going in Afghanistan? What is your take on that?
I think it's complete. And the reason why it's complete is that Lashkar-e-Taiba is basically at war with the Islamic State. And the Islamic State's even targeted Lashkar-e-Taiba. And the reason is that Lashkar refuses to do takfir, right? Lashkar refuses to get involved in sectarian killing. So they don't, when they're in India, they'll kill Muslims, they don't care, right? But when they are in a Muslim state, they don't engage in intra-Muslim conflict. This is one of their core tenets, right? Because it's it's sort of like you don't piss in your own bathtub, right? So they don't do this. And now this doesn't mean that you haven't had people from Lashkar-e-Taiba defect, right? And you've had defectors. But one should not confuse a defector showing up in another group with LET facilitation. So I'll tell you, this, I saw India do this after the November 2008 attacks. Everyone wanted to paint Lashkar with Al-Qaeda, right? Because if we say it's Al-Qaeda, people will care. Anyone that had a terrorist group that they wanted people to pay attention to, they would say, and it's supporting Al-Qaeda, right? This was bullshit then, and it's bullshit now. And so this is, and I feel for India, right? India is trying to make the world care about a group that largely only kills Indians, right? And how do you do that? You either say they're Al-Qaeda or you say they're Islamic State. But you don't need to say this. I mean, Lashkar is in fact incredibly dangerous on its own. And just as the efforts to paint it Al-Qaeda really, I think, had a backlash, everyone that made that argument looked like a jackass. History will judge the same people doing that today. So Islamic State in Afghanistan is also not Islamic State, right? It is hard, and it's very difficult. I mean, I go to Afghanistan at least once a year. It's really difficult to tell what's going on. For one thing, a lot of the Islamic State guys, they have nothing to do with the Caliphate and al-Baghdadi's organization, or they don't. They're basically former Taliban who are disgruntled, either because the Taliban are prosecuting peace or because the Taliban have had close ties to the ISI. They're basically using the Islamic State as an opportunity to engage in violence and to use it as an excuse to break free of the Taliban. And this has been facilitated by the death of Mullah Omar and the death of Osama bin Laden. Like, when those two men were alive, the discipline between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban was very, very strict. But after Osama bin Laden was killed, drone be upon him, and after Mullah Omar died, it was very difficult to keep the discipline in these ranks. And so this is when you saw many of these Dale Bundy groups defecting to the Islamic State. What you have to remember about the Dale Bundys, not like Lashkar, right? They are sectarian, right? We saw people defecting and going to Syria and Iraq before the Caliphate had even been declared by al-Baghdadi. And that's because they were inherently sectarian. So the differences in these groups matter. So what is Islamic State in Afghanistan? In my assessment, they're mostly disgruntled Talibs. Now, the Afghans swear up and down that the Islamic State in Afghanistan is actually ISI. And I did not necessarily initially believe that, but increasingly I see the logic in that argument, right? Because the Pakistanis always stay ahead of the curve. And if you have disgruntled Taliban that are willing to be particularly brutal, it does help to keep the Taliban in check, right? Because they can use these former Taliban, now calling themselves Islamic State, to attack the Taliban, right? So they essentially become another tool that the ISI has to corral the Taliban, who, by the way, hate the Pakistanis, right? The Taliban know that the Pakistanis only care about the Taliban as instruments of violence, right? And so the Taliban have many faults, but they are Afghan. And so this schism is real. And so the ISI has a definite interest in cultivating them. And then, of course, on the other hand, the Pakistani Taliban also has its leadership in Kunar, which is where the Islamic State hides. So wouldn't it be great if the Pakistanis had another organization that could try to keep an eye on the Pakistani Taliban leadership in Kunar? So increasingly, I find the Afghan argument to be credible. But hard evidence for it outside of the intelligence world, I think, is really hard to get. And I actually don't trust the intelligence. And the reason I don't trust the intelligence is that people don't know the language.
In your book, you present Lashkar-e-Taiba as one of the most almost an establishmentarian non-state actor. And you went on to claim the irrational actors, which a lot of people would not agree in a lot of cases. But you also you said that over the years, ISI has supported and controlled Lashkar-e-Taiba. And my question primarily is in two parts. Okay, for our viewers who doesn't know about the ideological roots or the organization as such, you can give a brief about Lashkar-e-Taiba, and if you can tell us why does ISI particularly prefers Lashkar-e-Taiba over other groups? And
It's really simple because the other groups conduct violence in Pakistan.
Okay.
Right? So even Jaish, right? Jaish has a history of splitting, right? So Lashkar-e-Jungzi and Jaish, they go back and forth. The Pakistan Taliban had many of its cadres come from Jaish, right? So these Deobandi groups are much more fluid. They don't have this sort of top-down discipline that's imposed upon them, right? So Jaish, when it's under Masood, when you have Masood Hazar's cadres in his arms, they're very lethal, right? But they may also one day join the Islamic State in Pakistan. They may join Lashkar-e-Jungzi in Pakistan. And it was the original defectors from Jaish that, for example, tried to kill Musharraf. Because what one has to remember is those Deobandi groups, not Lashkar, are tied to Al-Qaeda. Daniel Pearl, the killing of him, was Al-Qaeda in imagination, but Deobandi in execution. And the reason for that is it was the Deobandi groups like Harkatul Ansar that were co-located with the Taliban, who then brought Osama bin Laden in, right? Lashkar was never a part of that. So in contrast, Lashkar-e-Taiba, they will say, no matter how undesirable a leader is in Pakistan, you cannot conduct violence. They don't believe in takfir, apostatization. They believe only in dawah and tabligh. They will say, this is very controversial for them. They do not advocate killing Ahmadis, whereas everyone does, right? So this is the biggest distinction, is that Lashkar calls for peace within Pakistan, and the Deobandi groups do not do that consistently. And so there's this great, not as in like great, but fascinating thesis that was submitted by, I'm blanking on his name. He was basically the spokesperson for the Milli Muslim League, the party that the LET funded. He, of course, he did his master's at Pakistan's National Defense University, and I cite this in my book. His thesis was titled "The Threat That the Islamic State Poses to Pakistan," and he argues that Lashkar-e-Taiba is the only entity that can take on the Islamic State. And part of the argument is about these different interpretive beliefs about who can engage in takfir, right? Which is why when you said, is Lashkar-e-Taiba facilitating Islamic State in Afghanistan, I said, bull. Because people saying that are really trafficking in the assumption that people don't know that much about these groups. But that's why they're so important.
Small follow-up. So, in spite of all the dangers that Lashkar-e-Taiba impose on the Indian state, there's this another factor, Jamaat-ul-Dawa, that comes in, where they do some charity work in Pakistan. And a lot of Pakistanis do not take Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jamaat-ul-Dawa as a potent threat as the Indian state does. So why do you think, since you have spent your days as well in Pakistan in the early 90s, if I'm supposed,
all the way from the early 90s to 2013.
Yeah.
A lot of my life there.
Yeah. So why do you think, if you have interacted with the local people, why do you think that they do not agree or they do not consider Lashkar-e-Taiba as a potent threat or as a militant organization as the Indian state does?
Okay, so again, going to my point, they've never attacked Pakistanis,
Yeah.
right? They believe that Lashkar-e-Taiba only exists in India. So it's a really complicated argument. So the Jamaat al-Dawa, what they say is not technically alive. Jamaat al-Dawa is the name of the organization in Pakistan itself. The only part of the organization which is still called Lashkar-e-Taiba is the organizational structure in Indian Kashmir, right? So, I mean, I'm trying to think of an example. So, it's a branding issue, right? So, in this way, it's a little bit like Hezbollah, right? We have this huge charity part, but we have a smaller part of us that engages in military action. But that military action never hurts their supporters. So in Pakistan, this is very, very important, because what the state does, the state organizes opportunities for people to over-assess what Jamaat al-Dawa is doing. And here's one of my favorite examples. You'll remember the earthquake in 2005 of Kashmir. If you go back and you look, and I think I was in my 30s when that went down. So I was a fully sentient adult. I was in Pakistan. I was watching I was in Pakistan talking to the helicopter pilots that were, doing the relief. If you go back, you will have the impression that only jihadis were doing relief. What was actually happening was that there were very few jihadis doing the relief, but you can't just go to Kashmir, right? On the Pakistani side, you have to have ISI or Ministry of Information, AQ to go there, and they escort you. So they were deliberately escorting media to the jihadi relief areas, right? So people were essentially misreporting who was doing the relief. The World Bank, several years later, did a survey of nearly 260,000 households. I mean, it is just huge. So they essentially interviewed most households that were along the earthquake fault line. And they asked people who did the relief. They could only recall remember, nearly 260,000. They only had 260 households that remembered getting assistance from a militant group. And those households, guess where they were? They were right outside of Lashkar-e-Taiba's camp. So essentially, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jamaat al-Dawa, rolls out and helps these people. But the ISI directed all of the journalists to go to those Jamaat al-Dawa facilitations. And so the whole world had this idea that these jihadis were doing this great work. I have a colleague who wrote an entire book about this, where she basically says that jihadis are relief workers, right? You talk about a psyop, right? This book is just, you have to hold it like this to keep the bullshit from falling out. They did this again with the flood. And I was in Pakistan during the flood, and I visited camps, and I never saw a single jihadi. And the same thing happened. They would take journalists to the jihadi camp, and journalists would talk about how all the great work the jihadis are doing, right? The same thing happened in Balochistan during earthquakes. They only let Jamaat al-Dawa do relief in Balochistan. Now, this is more sinister. They have been using Jamaat al-Dawa in Balochistan to promote their agenda, which is Islamist. Jamaat al-Dawa, believe it or not, they're explicitly pro-CPEC. So in the Milli Muslim League's manifesto, they talk at great length how they support the great relationship with Pakistan and how they're going to do everything they can to facilitate CPEC, right? So when you start looking at them as a domestic actor, you really see that they're the handmaiden of the deep state in a way that none of the other militant groups are, right? All of the other militant groups have what we'll call negative externalities. Like, you support Jaish, but you know there's going to be blowback. You support the Afghan Taliban, even though you have the Pakistan Taliban, right? Lashkar-e-Taiba is the only group that has only benefits There is no downside to this organization from the Pakistani state's point of view. And so if you were a Pakistani, why would you see them as a threat, right? They kill Indians, right, who are killing Muslims in their belief system, and they're not entirely wrong in that. And they're the only organization that's doing relief in hard to reach places. Even in Sindh, you can't friggin' believe it. You will find Hindus in Sindh who love Jamaat al-Dawa. Yeah. Why do they love them? Because in Sindh, there has been an ongoing drought for about a decade. Who is providing them relief to the drought? Jamaat al-Dawa. Now, why is Jamaat al-Dawa?
Pretty surprising. That's very surprising.
It's not surprising, right? Because Jamaat al-Dawa doesn't believe in killing minorities. They believe in converting them. Right? So it's a very Christian model, right? Which is you go into a deprived community and you do lots of good work and you convert them. Right? It's what Christians do in India all the time. Right? So right. So so the more you know about how Lashkar operates inside Pakistan, the more surprised you are. But the more you learn, the more you understand why a Pakistani doesn't view them as a threat, because they're not a threat. That's the brilliance of it. It's the only organization that doesn't threaten Pakistanis and only serve their interests at home and abroad.
But it seems a lot of conversion, right? Minority conversions in Pakistan.
Well, so there's a lot of forced conversion, right? I saw this when I was a student in Pakistan. I studied the Sikh and Hindu communities, and so I went all over, and I stayed in different ashrams in Pakistan and so forth. It's very common that a Muslim will go in and kidnap a Hindu girl and rape her and force her to convert. And then the families don't, this is no different than in India. Once a girl has been raped in many communities, they don't want her back. And she basically goes off and she has to make her peace with this. This still happens in India too, so it's not so bizarre. But that is a very common way of forced conversions. And for many years, the Indian government really didn't want to let these Hindus come to India because they were afraid that they might be jasuses. So obviously this government views them differently. I think that they are a deeply endangered community, and anything that can be done to get them out of Pakistan should be taken. I don't like how the current law gives certain religions priority, but I do agree that the Hindus of Pakistan are a very endangered community, and there should be means to get them out. But not all of them want to leave. A lot of the Sindhi Hindus, their lives are there, their lands are there, their shrines are there. A lot of them are Nanak Panthis, and a lot of the early life of Guru Nanak's first son is there. So not everyone wants to leave, but those who want to leave should be facilitated.
All right. So on the next question, ma'am, I would like to go on the American policy front. So correct me if I'm wrong, the relationship between America and Pakistan has always been of a love-hate relationship. And we have seen that America has, to a level, they have supported Pakistan, they have trained the military, they have financed them, they have armed them to become fellow insurgents. But what we have witnessed is that instead of being fellow insurgents, they actually got into the insurgency business. So what exactly went wrong with the America's assessment here in context of Pakistan?
So this went back, to the 1950s. Like, we were training them to be potential counterinsurgents in communist insurgencies. And if you go back, as I did in my first book, which is also all primary sources, I looked at Pakistan military journals. we were training them to be counterinsurgents with us, and they were learning how to run insurgents.
So, David, that was during Ayub Khan's regime, if I'm not wrong.
It was in the 50s. Yeah. Right. So this goes back a very long time. This isn't new.
Okay.
So I think the best book on this is Hossein Haqqani's Magnificent Delusions. He's got
Yes.
I mean, it's just, there's nothing I can add to that book. So it's not that the Americans didn't know, right? And so you could say, well, what were the Americans getting out of this? And it's true, as an American, it's easy to say we weren't getting much out of it. But what we were getting was the U-2 overflight from Badabur Air Force Base, right? The U-2 flight, which were these very high altitude planes that would take off from Badabur Air Force Base, and they would take photographs of the Soviet Union. And there was this elaborate mechanism where they would drop the film at different places, and U.S. assets would gather the film. And that's how we were able to get a lot of intelligence about what the Soviet Union was doing. And this worked for many, many years until one of these U-2s was shot down. And Gary Powers was the pilot. What the Pakistanis said was incredibly similar to what they would say about drone flights when Pakistan complicity was revealed in the drone flight, many decades later. They would say, oh, we didn't know what was happening. We didn't realize this. We were forced by the Americans. We're a poor third world country. Please don't attack us. Because the Pakistanis were very afraid that the Soviets would invade Pakistan. And so the Pakistanis were able to then turn that risk of invasion into even greater allurements from the United States, right? So Pakistan it generates risk, which it then monetizes. But Pakistan was already handsomely compensated for the use of that base at Badabur Air Force Base. So Pakistan is just very good at being a marginal satisfier. And it's not that the U.S. doesn't know that we're being played. It's that Pakistan has also generated a perception that it's just too dangerous to fail. And that if the United States pushes Pakistan too much in one direction, it's going to fail, and then all hell will break loose. And policymakers are very afraid of those nuclear weapons getting into the hands of terrorists. And the irony is that the more money we give them, the more nuclear weapons they build. They've invested in battlefield nuclear weapons, which some people, I think, erroneously call tactical nuclear weapons. So, ironically, our strategy of engagement has facilitated the likelihood of our worst nightmare happening. And I think that's ultimately why states have nuclear weapons, is that they can coerce the international system. And Pakistan has been very effective for the same reason why India doesn't have a serious capability of invading Pakistan is the same reason why the Americans don't have a serious capability of punishing Pakistan. Is that the nuclear weapons are risk generating, and that always figures into calculus about punishing Pakistan.
The next question is coming to the Afghanistan and Pakistan theater. Pakistan has reserved its stance on the peace dialogue in Afghanistan as an observer, a facilitator. What is the strategic depth here we are looking at with those words, okay? And is Pakistan's role with the latest development in Afghanistan peace process just limited to the role of a facilitator or an observer, or is it way beyond that?
Look, I mean, this is also such. Essentially, Trump went out of Afghanistan before the election, right? And Zalmay Khalilzad, I mean, he honestly is a first-class. He will do anything. I mean, he is just. He has no soul, so he's going to do whatever it takes because he wants to be Secretary of State in the next Trump administration. And so what essentially we are planning on doing is handing the Afghans back to the Pakistanis, just like we did in 1990. We handed our Afghan policy right back over. The problem is that Afghans don't want to be handed back to the Pakistanis. And so the US government has done everything it can to sort of circumvent the Afghan government. The Afghan government itself does itself no favors because of the way elections have been conducted and the ongoing standoff with Abdullah and Ghani, which if they were to be a more effective Afghan government, there'd be much more effective resistance. But the Afghan government is resisting being handed back to the Pakistanis. And what the Americans are trying to do is force this situation upon the Afghans. So Pakistan's not a facilitator. Pakistan is a direct beneficiary. Now, my only hope is that the Taliban leadership has been eviscerated by COVID, which is true. A lot of the Taliban, a lot of the leaders have COVID.
And I heard news coming up that Mullah Omar's son has been taking the top position of the leadership in Taliban Shura.
Yeah, because of COVID, but also because of the controversy about what was his name?
Sirajuddin Haqqani?
No. The guy who covered up Mullah Omar's death for the Pakistanis. Akhundzada. I'm forgetting which one of these schmucks did that.
Mullah Akhundzada.
I don't remember it was Akhundzada. Whichever the Taliban was, it was covering up for Mullah Omar's death and was making himself the interlocutor. I thought it was Akhundzada. But so there was a lot of controversy about who was going to be the successor, right? And then you, on top of that, you add COVID. So who knows? Maybe COVID is going to save the Afghans. But that's basically, Pakistan is not a facilitator. It's a direct beneficiary. We are essentially taking Afghanistan, kicking and screaming, and we're trying to marry them off to the Pakistanis. It's horrible. It is unbelievably horrible. I oppose this with every cell in my body.
Okay, ma'am. So for the last question, I think this is the best way we can end it. So being an Indian and you being Professor Christine Fair, I think we have this common obsession with Pakistan, and I think we should end that with this note only. So India, you have often stressed upon this fact that India needs to think about sub-conventional deterrence instead of a full-scale war to combat Pakistan. So what are the elements of the sub-conventional response from the Indian side we are looking for in the near future?
So, I mean, to be frank, Ajit Doval has said a lot of the correct things. It's just that he has done much more talking than he has executing. So here's the problem with intelligence activities. You and I should never hear about it, right? We should never hear about it. We should see assassinations, right? And the problem that India has, no, we should see footprints, but we should not know who's behind them, right? Now, the problem that India has is that it seems to think that Balochistan is the way to go. And from a strategy point of view, absolutely, right? It's, why not add more fuel to that fire? Yadav, of course, was an Indian asset. What Pakistan says about him is not true, but what India has said about him is not true. And Praveen Swami, the reason why Praveen Swami is on the outside is that Praveen Swami found the truth about him. Right? He was not a retired naval officer. He was never gazetted as being retired. So he was there as an active duty naval officer in Iran, where he was captured.
Excuse 1 second, ma'am. Are you talking about Kulbhushan Jadhav here?
Yes.
Okay, I think you mentioned Praveen Swami here instead of Kulbhushan Jadhav.
No, I said this is why Praveen Swami is in trouble. He uncovered the truth about Kulbhushan Jadhav. That's why Praveen's in trouble. He also managed to get the truth published when others were not able to do that. So so the problem with intelligence is that we often see their failures, right? But we should not be seeing their successes. This is the hallmark of intelligence. And Gujarat, I.K. Gujarat, he basically pulled all of India's operators out of Pakistan as a part of a goodwill gesture. And that is, you don't really recover from that because you've just burnt all of your assets, right? And then it's fairly easy for the Pakistanis to go in and sweep them up. So how do you rebuild those assets after you've completely pulled them all out? It's actually very, very difficult. So
I think we are still paying for the I.K. Gujarat's tragedy on that particular front because there are so many calculations being made.
Oh no, absolutely. I mean, this is it's a football bat, and who needs a football bat? So it's very difficult to that situation, and especially now when the Pakistanis are much more watchful and wary of what the Indians might do. So, but going back to the Balochistan situation, I actually think Balochistan is a terrible choice for the Indians because the Baloch insurgents are not coherent. They're not disciplined. They kill civilians. And what India doesn't want to lose the moral high ground, right? It doesn't want to be, you kill our civilians, so we're going to kill your civilians in Balochistan, right? And that also means that the Baloch aren't going to support you if their civilians are being killed by your proxies, right? And your proxies are actually Pakistanis with suitcases of money, right? India is much better served exploiting these tensions, these intra-jihadi tensions, right? So, for example, the Pakistani Taliban, they hate Lashkar-e-Taiba, right? How hard is it to get one of these Pakistani Talibs to knock off an LET leader? How hard is it to play these groups off of one another? And if you do it well, you never know that that's actually an Indian suitcase of money, right? If you play this well, this looks like a Pakistani suitcase of money going to a Pakistani to kill a member of Lashkar-e-Taiba. But the Indians seem really interested in focusing on Balochistan because it's easy, but that will strategically redound to India's disadvantage because if a bunch of Baloch citizens are being murdered and India is found to be involved in it, how does that help India at home or abroad, right? So I think India should really be thinking about exploiting these inter-jihadi factions. And look, there's always going to be targets of low-hanging fruit. When the Pakistanis target Indian personnel in Afghanistan, target them back. Another thing that pisses me off about India is why does it still even entertain having a high commissioner in Delhi when these things happen, right? The defense attaché is always the ISI chief. Send him home. Kick him out. And yet, I don't know. India is just like, okay.
I'll just conclude it.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right.
So before concluding, ma'am, there's a small task for you, which we give to all our guests. It's not a great, a huge task. It's just a very small task. And as a professor, you will love it. So 5 books that our viewers should read. Your top 5 recommendations.
Oh, actually, there's too many books, but I'll tell you the books that I am reading right now. And you have to excuse me because I want to get the exact references. All right, so the first book is Maria. Okay, so obviously I'm a nerd, right? So I'm going to be. These are books that I don't read. I don't read stuff that people would find fun. If that makes sense. But so the first book is by Maria Rashid. It's called Dying to Serve. And this is an amazing book on the enlisted, right? She has just done really, and she's really focusing on the so-called SALT range, right? Which is like the bread and butter enlisted. The other book is called, So I'm a big fan of Indians learning more about their participation in the Great War. Because for too long, Indians, if you follow me on Twitter, whenever I see a war movie that doesn't represent the South Asians, I'm like, ah! Right? For that reason, by the way, see 1914. 1914 does a really good job of representing South Asians in a way. I think Hollywood finally learned after the outrage at Dunkirk. So this book is called Faithful Fighters. And it's Faithful Fighters, and it's essentially about the British Indian Army, right? So the other book, now this actually is kind of fun. I started reading it last night. I'd been wanting to read it for a really long time. It's called Daughter of the Empire by Lady Pamela Hicks. Lady Pamela Hicks is the daughter of the Mountbatten. Now, what I love about this book, we have known for years that Lady Mountbatten and Nehru were kind of, you know, shayad hum bistari ka rahe the back in the day. Lady
क्या खा रहे थे?
hum bistari.
अच्छा, अच्छा, अच्छा.
शायद आगे से, शायद पीछे से, मुझे क्या मालूम है. Lady Pamela Hicks, she lays it all out there. All of the dudes that her mom was banging, and also her dad. I mean, they had an open marriage, and she's just like, full kimono, there she is. The other book, what? I'm just telling you.
No problem.
The other book that I just, this is a really hard read. Is called, do you know Lizzie Collingham? Lizzie Collingham writes about history from the point of view of food. And her book is called Taste of War, World War II and the Battle for Food. Most people don't know that the deaths from famine in World War II exceeded the battlefield deaths, right? And dying by starvation is probably one of the most grueling ways to die. And I mean, obviously one of her case studies is the Bengal famine, right? That was essentially orchestrated so that the British soldiers would be able to, you know, basically eat while Indians were starving. There's no other nice way of saying it. And the other one that I recently read, I have to get it off my bookshelf. Hold on.
Okay.
It's this one, The Indian Army in the First World War by Kaushik Roy.
Yeah.
So these are the 5 books that I just think are really worth spending some time. But obviously,
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Right.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
All the best for the protest. Thank you, ma'am. Bye.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Bye, ma'am. Bye.